Thanks for tuning in once again to Moments That Matter. This week we're concluding our two-part interview with Dr. Corey Latta regarding his newest book, C.S. Lewis and the Art of Writing.
So in one letter, Lewis urges the recipient of the letter to, quote, read all the good books you can and avoid nearly all magazines. And he also offers the advice to turn off the radio. So I think it's interesting that a man who was featured on the cover of Time and who was responsible for popular BBC broadcasts during World War II would be so against these media. So what does that tell us about the writer C.S. Lewis?
Yeah, he was such a purist. I mean, he just was this bookish purist, and nothing replaced for Lewis the experience of the hardbound copy and the written page. I think he embraced these mediums because it was he had a message worth telling and worth being heard, and that was the way in which they were going to find an audience and a larger audience that than would have ever been available otherwise. So I think he embraced them, but he and Tolkien. I mean, Lewis in his De Descripte Temporum, his inaugural address to Cambridge, said, "I'm a dinosaur." I mean, he associated himself with his dinosaur. He was completely out of touch in some regards with the not just the literature of his day, but the media of his day. And he was so old souled in that sense, But those radio addresses from which we get Mere Christianity. Providential, right? I mean, ironic as you're pointing out, but also providential. And I think he recognized the importance of getting that kind of message out to an audience. Ironically, it was the book, though, right? It finally finding its form via the book that would seal the legacy of those addresses.
Mm-hmm.
If it just stopped at the radio addresses, so I think it's fitting that it ends up being, a book that those addresses finally sort of land in the form of,
Mm-hmm. A chapter of your book I found personally very meaningful, I suppose because of my age, was your discussion of Lewis right before he started on the Chronicles of Narnia.
Yeah.
I'm sure many people don't know, as you point out, that Lewis felt like his best work was behind him at that point.
Yeah.
He wrote in one of his letters, quote, "I am now in my 50th year. I feel my zeal for writing whatever talent I originally possessed to be decreasing, nor do I believe I please my readers as I used to."
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, everything changed. And Lewis produced these works that, he's actually most fondly remembered for. So what kind of encouragement can you bring, you personally, to those who are older or perhaps have been writing for a while but with less success than they would have liked?
Yeah, I find that deeply encouraging too. I just turned 40 in April, and I'm a pretty old souled fellow myself, and I have the feeling of like, well, kind of washed up. Like the best days behind me. Had a couple of good shots there, and that's it. So I take a lot of personal comfort there too. It reminds me, I just wrote a little article on a series of letters that was just recently discovered, actually, between Lewis and an American scientist. I think it was at Ashland University, named Van Osdale. And this was in the last summer of Lewis's life. And Lewis had suffered some pretty severe, health complications, and then would, go on to die that fall of 63. But Van Osdale is writing to him, and he wants to write a book on science and literature, science and Christianity. And Lewis says, I'm basically an invalid at this point, and I don't think I can be of much use to you. But then he connects with Van Osdale on the subject of grief. Van Osdale's son had just died a couple of years before, and Lewis says, essentially, I know very well what grief feels like, and he's referencing the death of his wife Joy, right? And I titled the piece "Being of Use" because he says, "I don't think it'd be of much use to you," and at the same time, he is such a warm voice of fellowship and friendship to him. And I almost think that sort of circles back around. You just don't know what power your words are going to carry. I mean, you just don't. And God is no respecter of age. It doesn't matter. It's fitting to me that some of Lewis's most powerful writing was never meant for publication. His letters, I mean, this book that I wrote, C.S. Lewis and the Art of Writing, would not have been written had it not been for his letters. I mean, it's just, it's almost like a love letter to his letters. And, those things were never meant to be published. And he wrote those all the way to the day of his, essentially the day of his death. And it goes back to this idea of being faithful to the work, committing yourself to the circle. If you're faithful to that, and if any listeners have not read Tolkien's Leaf by Nigel, you should read it. It's a short story. It's a beautiful little short story, and it's an homage to this, the idea that the artist, the writer, isn't doing enough or successful enough or influential enough, and it's a beautiful little story about what God can do with that and what he's already done with it behind the scenes in ways you don't understand. And trust God that you are being of use even when you don't feel like you are as a writer.
Well, speaking of Tolkien, I suppose we would be remiss if we didn't at least mention Lewis's relationship with Tolkien, author of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, of course, and a contemporary of Lewis's at Oxford. And you say, Corey, at one point that, quote, writing is best done in a relationship. Can you talk about the influence each had on the other as a writer?
Yeah, and I refer people to Diana Glyer, who's a great Inkling scholar. She wrote a great book called The Company They Keep, and then she wrote a kind of a more popular version called Bandersnatch about this relationship between all the Inklings. So, Tolkien and Lewis meet at Oxford, and Lewis was, between the two, I would say, more ambitious and more prolific in some ways in terms of his output, right? After he becomes a Christian, he is just a machine. I mean, he puts out, and he's famous for not being much of a reviser in some regards. I mean, Walter Hooper said that, Lewis never took a stab at a second draft. He wrote it and was done, which is pretty remarkable if you've tried your hand at writing. That's not totally true, but it's pretty true. So Lewis had this kind of engine in him where he was going to create and create and create. Tolkien's influence, though, but Tolkien was a sort of a slower processor, I think, and more of a kind of an internalized figure. So he was writing just as much, but his output wasn't as great. I mean, he wrote academic text and essays and things like that. But, he wrote The Hobbit, and it came out in 1937, and The Lord of the Rings wouldn't come out until, the 1950s. And he just churned away on this thing. Lewis was an incredible audience for Tolkien. I mean, they would have these famous meetings at, the Eagle and Child or the Bird and Baby, and they would read a lot of their unpublished work and sort of be a sounding board or resonators for one another, and sometimes critics as well. And it was really Lewis's prompting and encouraging for Tolkien to do something with it. If it were up to Tolkien, I don't know that we'd ever seen Lord of the Rings. I mean, Lewis is the one that said, you got to get this thing out. And inversely, I think Tolkien provided Lewis with a lot of quality control sometimes. I mean, they had a very different view, for example, of the way you would handle mythology. In the Chronicles of Narnia, you've got this kind of hodgepodge mythology. I mean, you've got, Father Christmas, and you've got cosmology mixed in there, and, medieval thought and allusions to, Greco-Roman and all this stuff. Tolkien is creating a myth of his own, very much influenced by Norse and Germanic mythologies. And I think Tolkien, being the purist that he was able to be a voice of reason and purity in a sense, maybe even ground Lewis a little bit. But it was, I think, more than anything else, just the mutual presence of a fellow creative that spurred the other on to deeper creativity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so you mentioned Walter Hooper just now. That's another figure who, is prominent in Lewis's literary legacy.
Yeah.
His executive secretary for a brief period before his death, but then the editor of all these posthumous works that we have, which I don't even think a lot of people understand how much was published after Lewis's death. But just FYI, Corey, just want you to know Hooper and I are both Tar Heels. And I had the chance to meet him 3 years ago in Oxford. And, it's funny, he's this octogenarian, mild-mannered, really charming. I mean, just really charming. Yeah. But the truth is, not everyone likes him.
I've got that, yeah.
And not everybody believes that he actually has, the best interest of the Lewis estate in his heart sometimes, in terms of the things he says and does and all that stuff. But, sort of all that aside, can you talk about the influence of Walter Hooper on C.S. Lewis's legacy and, as much as you know?
Yeah, I've always wanted to meet Walter and never have, and don't know that I will. I would love to though. Seems like a really sweet guy. I don't have any opinions about him personally. I am familiar, with some of the complaints or the criticisms of the way he's handled the Lewis estate. I'll say this: we owe him a great debt. I mean, he has ferried all of Lewis's content into accessible publication. Mm-hmm. Just about all his significant works, certainly, to successful publication, and brokered in a sense anyone who's ever read Lewis after the day of his death kind of brokered that relationship with Lewis. So we owe him a great debt. At the same time, and I don't know that I would have ever done a better job myself or anyone could, when you have that kind of unilateral, I guess you could say, control over someone's creative works and estates, and you are the guy sort of writing the commentary, you almost become the spokesperson for the dead in that sense. It's going to take on a particular shape, it's unavoidable. And I don't think it would look, his estate and the way his publications have been handled, I don't think it would look the same in the hands of another person. But that's not to say that someone else's hands would have been more capable. Mm-hmm. So I do think there needs to be, maybe greater consideration and further conversations about the shaping of Lewis's legacy, because Hooper's hands have been so, tightly wound around it. Mm-hmm. But I don't mean that at the same time, I don't mean that as a critique.
And also maybe the lack of loss of some of his work too.
Yeah, right.
Because at least according to Hooper, if it was up to Warney, Lewis's brother, a lot of that stuff would have been thrown in the fire. And so...
Yeah. And apparently a lot of it was. I mean, Lewis himself would chunk of stuff in the fire.
So one thing I try to convince my doctoral students of is the need to not only be accurate in their research, but also persuasive and even interesting in their writing, which seems like kind of a novel idea to them for some reason. So as you note in one of your chapters, if the writing is unclear, then the profundity of the idea won't matter. Right. And you quote Lewis saying, so many people, when they begin research, lose all desire and presently all power of writing clear, sharp, and unambiguous English. And I think I've seen some of that. So why do you think that happens? What can academic writers do to guard against that?
Yeah, I teach this when I'm teaching research papers, because it comes up all the time, and I think it's voice. I think it takes, in the same way, I think that the creative life mirrors the personal life, and I would even say the spiritual or emotional life. And I think if someone doesn't know who they are, and I mean in a deep existential sense, it's hard to sound, well, Lewis's, which I think is maybe his best work, Till We Have Faces, or The Great Divorce. There's this process of sort of gaining yourself, right, becoming real. That's not just a spiritual phenomenon. I think that it's borne out in our creativity. So what I encounter are, these novice writers who are bringing in all these other voices. That's what a source is. I mean, it's what research is. It's someone else's voice. And they don't know how to maintain their own or dominate that work with their own voice. They just kind of give their power away in all these quotes, And that was something I had to straddle in, because, Lewis and writing has so many quotes. I wanted Lewis's voice to actually be louder than mine in my book, but I did want to make sure my voice was being heard. I was controlling that narrative, But I don't think a lot of writers think about that. I think they forget the fact that this is their paper and it's their voice and it comes from their person. And if they don't know who they are and what their voice is, good luck keeping it,
And sort of follow-on question, do you think storytelling has any part in academic writing?
I'd like to think so. It was never a part of mine,
Okay.
It's like squeeze. That's why I started writing poetry. It was, the form. I have people ask me all the time, should they write students of mine, should they write first person? I tell them, yeah, write first person. You can still be, because here's the deal. I don't want to get off on a little rant here, but this whole thing of, and you probably wrote papers like this too, Paul. I know I've written many. This paper will explore this. The paper can't do anything.
Yeah.
Right? You're writing it, so let's just go ahead and just be, plain-faced and intellectually honest here. It is still your. So I want you to represent yourself, but I want to make sure that you are propped up by good research. I would like to see more personhood in our academics. I don't know why it's so personality less, and I would think that. If you ever read good journalism that has almost a, which the journalist is really sort of inhabiting the story. It reads like a narrative. There's one book, Into Thin Air by John Krakauer, which is a phenomenal piece of nonfiction about one of the deadliest days in the history of Everest. He was there. It's a story, though, but it is so well done, propped up by so much research and eyewitness experience. To me, it's a great piece of academia in some ways. It's not based on a hypothesis, a theory, or anything like that, but it's just solid and substantial. So I'd like to think it has place.
Mm-hmm. And maybe one final question, unless we want to pursue other things. Okay. What has Lewis taught you about being a writer and about good writing?
I would say the first thing is humility. Lewis himself, I mentioned this before, was, in the research for this book, I was absolutely shocked that Lewis abandoned projects at times. Like, he would write books that just weren't working for him and he'd scrap it. And like when he wrote Till We Have Faces, he didn't think a soul was going to, read that book. He did think it was by far and away his best book. And his wife Joy helped him quite a bit on that. But he didn't think it was going to gain him any sort of massive popularity. He thought that most of the stuff would be, out of print or forgotten soon after his death. And he just had a very humble perspective about what it is he was doing. So I think, to again, serve the process that you feel called to, but don't find your identity, and it's hard not to, don't find your identity in it to some sort of unhealthy degree. So, and writing is a humbling act. It is hard. It is not easy to do it well anyway. It's easy to do it. It's not easy to do it well. So he's taught me kind of, I think, humility and then diligence. When I think about Lewis and his faithfulness so he answered every letter ever written to him. And he did not like it. A lot of people don't know this. He did not love it. It was a burden to him to answer all these letters. He was far too busy, and he would spend time on it every day. And that has now become a part of his corpus. Lewis's letters you can't really sort of become a serious Lewis scholar until you've gotten into his letters. And that writing was just, meant to be sent to some wife or something in Minnesota. It wasn't meant for publication or anything like that. But his faithfulness to the process of it and his diligence is maybe something that I think about it every day, because I can be so inconsistent or lazy, with my own process. So he's an inspiration in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I don't mean to be like a grandparent, hounding the children for when they're going to produce the next grandchild, but can you give us an idea of the kind of things that you're thinking about or working on?
Yeah, so I've got a book that is long overdue with the publisher, and it's because I've been so insecure about the form of it. It's actually called "Serve the Work: Thoughts on Creativity and Christianity," and it is very, very unconventional in its form. So it really is a series of kind of reflections and aphorisms about what it means to create. And I've basically said that, because what does it mean for the Christian to be a creator? Why is that any different from a non-Christian being a creator? I've asked myself that question for years, and I've never read anything really satisfactory except for maybe Madeline L'Engle. And it dawned on me that I think the creative act should almost mimic the arc of the incarnation. That creativity is sort of submission, in the same way that Christ submitted himself to the work of salvation and restoration. So you submit yourself to the creative work. That is inevitably met by rejection, and this is exactly what the incarnation looks like. Christ submitted himself to the work of humanity, was rejected by it. As a creator, you will be rejected. It's just going to happen. I mean, internally, externally, it's going to happen. And it's through rejection that you come to a place of acceptance. And acceptance is what Lewis demonstrates so well. It's, what, I don't know what's going to happen with this, but I'm going to do it anyway. And in the case of, the incarnation, it's ultimate acceptance into and by God, and the purpose to which Christ was called. And the same thing, it's no different really, I don't think, for the creator. Like, I may never see one of my pieces may never see the light of day, but I've got to do it. Hemingway had this great bit of advice. So did the poet Rainer Maria Rilke, that if you could not write, if you can ask yourself, must I write? And the answer is not unequivocally yes, you just need to stop. Stop. If you are meant to write, you're going to write. So to give yourself to it despite the rejection and accept that call. So that's my next book, and I'm trying to finish the manuscript now. And then I've got an idea for one based on a talk I gave that I'm excited to get into. I just need more time to devote to it, called The Child, the Dragon, and the Castle, which is really about who we're made to be, the dangers and perils and fears and insecurities and hurts and trauma we encounter, and then how we push past them to find, lives of purpose and freedom.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us today. That's awesome, and we hope for great success for you as a writer, and whether or not your books do well, that you just are a writer.
That's right.
So that's it for today, and we hope that you will tune us in again next time. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Moments That Matter, a podcast that looks at the moments in our lives that come along from time to time that have consequences long after the moment, especially those moments that have to do with the choice of vocation. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation, Parker Palmer speaks of a clearness committee in the Quaker tradition, wherein a group of older, wiser people ask questions of someone considering a life choice as a way of clarifying the next step. We may not meet with a committee about these big decisions, but we all have these critical junctures in our lives, which we can think of as clearness committee moments. We need to pay attention to these moments because they are profound and potentially life-altering. We'll relay stories from our lives and interview others about theirs, especially noting the clearness committee moments, those we choose to recognize and those that were sadly ignored, those decisions that were made with God in mind and those that were not. Our hope is that these podcasts will cause you to think of the same kind of moments in your life with new clarity.